So I have two basic points I'd like to talk about today. The first concerns why it's important to make sure that students are well equipped to effectively regulate their own learning outside of the class. And the second point, the one I'll be focusing on primarily, is that successive relearning arguably is the most important tool for students to have in their study strategy toolbox. Now, to begin, why do students need a toolbox in the first place? Well, I'd like you to consider what happens to students as they move from primary school through secondary school and then they hit college. First, they're expected to learn more. The sheer volume of information that they're expected to learn increases both within and across classes. Now, at the same time, students are spending the same or less time actually in class, which necessarily means that more and more of this learning is expected to take place outside of the class. And finally, it's the perfect storm here, as students move on, they get less and less guidance, structured activities to support that learning. And we tend to assume that by the time they hit college, they know what they're doing, they know how to learn, go forth and learn, right? So the idea is that students do need a toolbox to engage in self-regulated learning. So what tools might students have in their study strategy toolbox? We recently published a monograph in which we reviewed the research literatures for 10 different study strategies. And we tried to focus on strategies either that students do or can use in principle on their own with minimal guidance from instructors outside of the class. And for each of these 10, in essence, we distilled down the literature to assign it a utility rating, either low, medium, or high utility strategy. And we base these ratings on factors like what are the magnitude of the effects, how general are they across materials, learners, outcome measures, have they been shown to work in authentic education contexts, and so on. 5 of the 10 got low utility ratings, either because they don't produce very big effects or they have very, very limited use. And among these 5, let me point out that 2 of them are the strategies that students most frequently report using when they are regulating their own learning outside of the class. Now, in contrast, 2 and only 2 of the 10 got the highest utility rating: distributed practice, that is spreading your study out over time, and practice testing, or self-testing. And if you put these 2 together, if you self-test, spread out over time, you in essence have the 2 key ingredients for successive relearning. Now, there is a little bit more to it than that. I'll explain that in a moment, but let me kind of situate it in the kind of larger view here. My argument is that students do need a toolbox with study strategy tools. They do also need to know how to use them, and they have to be able to pick the right tool for the right task, right? Just like carpentry. And I'll propose that one important or common learning goal, particularly in early or intro-level courses, is for students to acquire a foundational knowledge base. And this might include key terms, key facts, concepts, theoretical assumptions, formulas, what have you, depending on the domain. But we do generally often believe that students need foundational knowledge so that when they move into advanced coursework, they can build on that in a cumulative fashion. And students often need to have some facility with this foundational information to be able to engage in higher level processing, in critical thinking. So my argument here is that for this purpose, successive relearning is arguably the best tool for the task. Okay? It produces very durable learning, long-term retention, and is relatively economical with respect to the time that it requires for students to implement. So what is it? Without further ado, successive relearning begins with an initial learning session that involves self-testing. And in particular of the form of retrieval, where you're trying to actively recall information from memory with restudy as needed until you can do it, until you can correctly recall the target information. And the simplest way to think about this is flashcards. It's the F word. You got a cue on one side. You attempt to retrieve the target information, flip that card over. If you're wrong, restudy it as needed, put it in the back of the stack, and try again until you can do it, right? And then you can take it out of the stack. Now, initial learning is the important first step, but it is not the place to stop, okay? The potency for long-term learning comes from relearning which in essence just means do it again. Do it again on some other day, preferably more than one other day. Pick that stack of flashcards back up, practice till you can correctly recall again, and do it again on another day. Okay? That's it. It's simple. It's a very mundane strategy, but it doesn't have to be fancy to be effective. It's highly effective for durable learning. So, to that end, I just want to show you a bit of data from 3 illustrative studies that can give you a sense of the potency of successive relearning for enhancing retention, durable learning. The first of these studies, just with simple verbal materials, kind of shallow into the pool here, foreign language vocabulary translations, word pairs, Swahili, English. We had students learn 70 of these items. Everybody engages in initial learning. Again, it's just a computerized flashcard program. We give them Swahili. They have to recall English. They get it wrong, goes to the back of the stack. And you go until they can get them all right. Okay, so they walk out the door on the first day knowing all 70 items. If that's all they did, if it was just initial learning, 1 week later we give them a test, 28% of the items they remember. Now, if we have them come back to the lab on some other day for one relearning session, just practice them again until you get them right. It's very, very quick. They're in and out of the lab in a few minutes. 1 week later, they've more than doubled their retention of these items. If you add a second relearning session, almost tripled your retention of these word pairs for a few additional minutes of practice. Now, of course, those are simple word pairs. Much of what we want our students to learn involves more complex material. So I regularly teach Intro Psych, and there's lots of key concepts we want students to learn. So in this study, in fact, used key concept definitions from Intro Psych. And to give you a sense, just an example, here is a concept availability heuristic from the topic of judgment decision making. And here's a 1-sentence definition of this concept. Now, in this study, we actually counterbalanced assigned these concepts either to be successively relearned or to a baseline control condition. Baseline control, we didn't have them practice, we didn't help them learn, but we did test them on our dependent our outcome measures because these are Intro Psych students. Teaching them Intro Psych concepts, we want to know how well do they know these concepts just from exposure in their classes alone. Now, for the successively relearned items, everybody gets initial learning just like I described. We give them the concept. They have to do it the hard way. They have to come up with the definition. And note here we emphasize, it doesn't have to be verbatim. We want the meaning of the concept. Use your own words if you want, as long as it's right. We want the meaning of the concepts. And you go until you get them all right. Okay? Now, the key manipulation here, how many times did we have them come back to the lab to relearn these concepts? Anywhere from 1 to 5 times. And then everybody after their last relearning session, 1 month and 4 months after relearning, come back to the lab, take final cued recall tests. Do you remember the meanings of these concepts? And these are not arbitrary intervals. If you take an intro class in the fall, you got 1 month winter break before you come back for advanced coursework in the spring. We hope that students remember some of what they've learned to build on. If you take a course in the spring, you've got 4 months of summer before you come back in the fall. Okay, here is performance on those cued recall tests over what I would argue are meaningfully long delays. First note the dotted line along the bottom. That's baseline control. That's how well students knew these concepts from exposure in their class. And mind you, students told us that they had learned 50% of these concepts in class. Okay? In contrast, look at the levels of retention that we get across these long delays. And again, these are Kent State students. They're not Harvard students. This is pretty impressive for us. And importantly, sad but true, our rivals at the basketball games chant, can't read, can't write, Kent State. Just catchy, but not particularly what you want to be known for. At any rate, note the improvements you get from increasing the number of relearning sessions, at least to intermediate levels. There's payoff, there's bang for the buck. Okay, finally, you might be wondering, does this really work in a classroom to enhance learning outcomes? One of our most recent studies, again, Intro Psych students in a large section, but this time we worked specifically with their instructor, and we got her key concepts. We said, give us what you think are the most important concepts you want your students to learn. And she gave us core concepts from 8 of the units she was teaching. 64, we split them in half, successively relearned half, baseline control for the other to see what students could do on their own. And for the successively relearned concepts, again, we start with an initial learning session, go till you get them all right. 3 relearning sessions subsequently. And we synchronize these with Sharon's class so that they began learning or practicing concepts in the same week that she was introducing them in their class. And it went on in a cascading fashion over the course of this semester. Okay? Now, the fun here is that we got permission to look at the course exams. And so we could go in and identify the questions that tapped the 64 target concepts that we used in the experiment. And I'd like to note that Sharon's exams were all multiple choice, no surprise, big intro psych. But the majority of her questions required comprehension, application, or inference. Very few of her questions were just direct memory, do you know what this concept is? Okay, so it is transfer. On those exam questions, more than a letter grade improvement for the successively relearned items, concepts, relative to the baseline control, the business as usual, the whatever students did to learn these concepts on their own outside of class. Okay? Now, you might wonder, what is business as usual? Well, most students report cramming the night before. And that's generally good enough, actually, to squeak by on an exam. The bad news is it's very, very bad for durable learning. It's very bad for long-term retention. And we often worry that students do just squeak by on an exam and then rapidly forget what they've learned. We were also concerned about this, and to evaluate it empirically, we had students take follow-up cued recall tests. Do you remember the meaning of these concepts? 3 days and 24 days after the exam. And just 3 days later, look at the level of retention for the baseline concepts. So the concern is warranted. The good news is successive relearning protects against loss. Okay? Good retention of the successively relearned items. Okay. So I've focused here primarily on a strategy for students to use outside of class, but there are important implications for instructors here too. Because in principle, it's a strategy that students could use. In practice, it's a strategy that they don't, or don't use properly. So students are going to benefit from some coaching from instructors. So imagine just taking a few minutes class time near the beginning of the semester to talk generally to students about how to approach their learning outside of class and describe this strategy as one that could be particularly useful for many of their learning goals. If you do this, I would suggest emphasizing to students the importance of full retrieval attempts. Don't just look at the cue and go, oh yeah, that's familiar, I know that. Also checking that what you have produced from memory is right. So students often mistakenly believe that they came up with something it must be right without checking accurately. But other than that, it's a simple strategy. Again, it's very mundane. It's very potent, though. Students probably also would benefit from a little bit of guidance about what to submit to successive relearning. So on study guides, help them identify the core concepts that are particularly amenable to using this strategy. And finally, at least some students probably would benefit from some guidance for time management. Okay? Cramming the night before does not require very much planning at all. Successive relearning will require planning because it necessarily requires spreading your study out on different days, right? So, for example, in a methods course that I teach regularly, the study guide does kind of loosely identify sets of concepts, right, in order presentation in the class, and then I recommend to my students, here is a schedule 2 weeks out from the exam, schedule your practice in this way to relearn these items. And they do report appreciating this guidance with respect to time management. So to bring it home, to wrap it up, again, 2 key points. I think as instructors, we need to focus not only on what we're doing inside the class, but on what our students are doing outside of the class and making sure that we're helping them identify the right tools for the right tasks. And finally, for many tasks, I would argue that successive relearning is a must-have tool. Highly durable learning, relatively economical with respect to the amount of time it takes, and it's a very good multi-purpose tool for the toolbox. Thanks. So I do have a polling question for you and a couple of follow-up suggestions for discussion. My polling question is this. So I have proposed to you that successive relearning can be very effective for helping students regulate their learning, enhance their durable learning. Are you enthusiastic about the possibility of this strategy? Are you skeptical? Are you somewhere in between? And then maybe talk with the folks next to you. If you're an enthusiast, maybe talk about the content that you believe it could help you or your students learn. And if you're a skeptic, among other things, I'd suggest maybe talk about what else would you want to know about successive relearning before you are willing to use it or to recommend it to your students. So thanks very much for submitting poll responses. Yes. Just very briefly, I will admit I expected many more skeptics. I would offer to everybody, if you have additional interest in successive relearning, I'm happy to talk with folks later in the day. And also feel free to email me. I'm happy to provide you with suggestions, recommendations. And I would particularly like to hear from the skeptics or the in-betweeners about concerns or reservations you have about the utility of this strategy. So please do feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to have a continued discourse about this strategy and other strategies that will help students regulate learning outside of the classroom. Thanks.